One of the most important steps in restoring a vintage Beetle is finding a good candidate to work on. You don't want to buy a car that is too rusty, damaged, or missing vital parts. Here are some tips on how to find a solid VW Beetle to restore and what to look for. First, you need to decide what year and model of Beetle you want. There are many variations of the classic Beetle, from the early split-window models to the later Super Beetles. Each one has its own charm and quirks, but also its own availability and price. Generally speaking, the older the Beetle, the more rare and expensive it is. You also need to consider if you want a standard or convertible Beetle, as they have different body styles and parts. Next, you need to do some research on where to look for Beetles for sale. You can check online platforms like eBay, Craigslist, or Facebook Marketplace, where you can find listings from private sellers or dealers. You can also look for local VW clubs or events, where you might meet other enthusiasts who have Beetles for sale or know someone who does. Another option is to visit junkyards or scrapyards, where you might find some hidden gems among the wrecks. Once you have found some potential Beetles to buy, you need to inspect them carefully before making an offer. The most important thing to look for is rust. Rust is the enemy of any classic car, and it can be very costly and difficult to repair. You should check the floor pans, the heater channels, the fenders, the doors, the trunk lid, and the engine compartment for any signs of rust or corrosion. You should also look for any holes, cracks, dents, or patches in the body panels. If possible, use a magnet to test if the metal is original or has been replaced with filler. Another thing to look for is damage. You should check if the car has been in any accidents or collisions that might have affected its structure or alignment. You should also check if the car has any mechanical or electrical problems that might affect its performance or safety. You should test drive the car if possible and listen for any strange noises or vibrations. You should also check the brakes, the steering, the suspension, the lights, and the gauges. Finally, you need to look for availability of replacement parts. One of the advantages of restoring a Beetle is that there are many parts available online or in specialty shops. However, some parts are more rare or expensive than others, depending on the year and model of your Beetle. You should make a list of all the parts that you need to replace or upgrade and check their prices and availability before buying the car. You should also factor in the cost of labor if you are not going to do the work yourself. Restoring a vintage Beetle can be a rewarding and fun project if you find a good car to start with. By following these tips on how to find a solid VW Beetle to restore and what to look for in terms of rust, damage, and availability of replacement parts, you can avoid buying a lemon and enjoy your classic car for years to come. In this section, we will show you how to disassemble the Beetle, tag, bag, and inventory the parts, and what order to follow for removing the body panels. This is an important step for restoring and transforming a vintage Beetle. The first thing we need to do is to remove the engine. The engine is located at the back of the car and it drops down from the bottom. We need to lift up the back of the car and support it with jack stands. Then we need to disconnect the battery, fuel lines, throttle cable, clutch cable, and wiring harness from the engine. We also need to remove the exhaust system and the rear bumper. Next, we need to loosen the 4 main mounting bolts that connect the engine to the transaxle. The transaxle is the gearbox and differential that drives the rear wheels. There is a spline shaft from the transaxle that slides into the engine. We need to use a jack or a dolly to support the engine and gently pull it away from the transaxle. Then we can lower the engine to the ground and roll it out from under the car. Now we have removed the engine, we can start taking apart the rest of the car. We will use a system of tagging, bagging, and inventorying every part we remove. This will help us keep track of what we have and what we need to replace or repair. We will use Ziploc bags, masking tape, permanent markers, and a notebook to label and record every part. We will start with the interior of the car. We will remove the seats, seat belts, carpet, door panels, dashboard, steering wheel, pedals, and wiring. We will also remove any accessories like radio, speakers, or gauges. We will be careful not to damage any parts that we want to reuse or restore. Next, we will move on to the exterior of the car. We will remove the hood, trunk lid, fenders, doors, windows, lights, mirrors, and trim. We will also remove any badges or decals that we want to keep. We will be careful not to bend or scratch any body panels that we want to repaint or repair. Finally, we will remove the front axle beam and suspension. The front axle beam is a rigid tube that holds the front wheels and steering components. We will disconnect the steering box, tie rods, shocks, brakes, and wheels from the axle beam. Then we will unbolt the axle beam from the chassis and lower it to the ground. We have now disassembled our Beetle completely. We have tagged, bagged, and inventoried every part we removed. We have also organized them into categories like engine, interior, exterior, and suspension. We are ready to move on to the next step of restoring and transforming our vintage Beetle. In this section, I'm going to show you how to strip the paint, use epoxy, and paint the Beetle with your desired color and finish. This is an important step to restore and transform a vintage Beetle. First, we need to remove the old paint from the body of the Beetle. There are different ways to do this, but I'm going to use a chemical paint stripper. This is a product that you apply to the paint surface and let it work for a few minutes. Then, the paint will bubble up and soften, and you can scrape it off with a plastic scraper or a wire brush. Be careful not to damage the metal underneath, and wear gloves and eye protection when using the paint stripper. After stripping the paint, we need to clean the metal surface with a degreaser and a rag. This will remove any dirt, grease, or residue that could interfere with the epoxy and the paint. Then, we need to sand the metal lightly with a 220 grit sandpaper to create some texture for better adhesion. Next, we need to seal the metal with an epoxy primer. This is a surface protector that will prevent rust and corrosion. It's also a good base for the paint. To apply the epoxy primer, we need to use a spray gun and an air compressor. We need to mix the epoxy as directed on the packaging, and spray it evenly over the entire body of the Beetle. We need to let it dry for at least 24 hours before sanding it lightly with a 400 grit sandpaper. Finally, we can paint the Beetle with our chosen color and finish. We need to use a high-quality automotive paint that is compatible with the epoxy primer. We also need to use a clear coat to protect the paint and give it some shine. To apply the paint and the clear coat, we need to use the same spray gun and air compressor as before. We need to follow the instructions on the paint cans for mixing, spraying, drying, and curing times. And that's how you strip the paint, use epoxy, and paint the Beetle with your desired color and finish. I hope you enjoyed this section and learned something new. Stay tuned for more tips on how to restore and transform a vintage Beetle.